So 2019 has left us, it's now 2020, and I just wanted to quickly go back over some of the games that I played in 2019 in a really casual audio only sort of version. So there'll be footage in the background, but you don't need to watch that. This is sort of like just to throw your headphones in and listen to me ramble about some of the games that I played. This video is going to be about Death Stranding, and it is a bit of an emotional roller coaster. There are some things that I talk about that I really like, and there are some things at the end that I talk about that really frustrated me. So let's just jump straight into it. We're going to be talking about the design, we're going to be talking about the story, we're going to be talking about a bunch of different parts of the video game. Let's do this. Death Stranding. Okay, are you guys in for a ride? Let's talk about how I'm going to structure this out. So I'll tell you what I thought of the game first. Then we'll go through what I really liked about the game. And then at the end, you're going to want to stick around for this because we are going to have a massive bitch session about some of the stuff in this game. And I don't know whether I'm going to be able to contain myself because I really like this game, but some of the stuff, man, holy Jesus, did it let me down. Anyway, that's how it's going to go. So let's jump straight into it. Did I like the game? Yes, I loved this game. I thought this game was great. The gameplay part of this game, the game part, is phenomenal. The work as a whole, or depending on how you want to describe it, the artistic piece as a whole, less. I like that less than the game part. This game is one of those ones where you've probably heard people use the term it's very meditative, and you've probably heard people talk about it being very tedious, and you've probably heard people talk about it being boring and abysmal. I didn't run into that at all. I can completely understand why people would think that. I can completely understand why people would be landing on this idea that this game is boring, that this game is tedious, that this game is indulgent, that this game is a bad game that should never have been made because it makes things like movement difficult. But I disagree fundamentally with all of those opinions. What I think is two reasons that a lot of that is happening, and I'm not saying that you can't have that opinion, I just didn't feel it myself. But what I think is two big reasons that make people think this way is, number one, that this is not a game for everyone. FIFA is a soccer game. It's a sports game that's very, very heavy on its sports system mechanics. You do real world soccer things where you kick a ball around, and then I'm guessing, I'm not very familiar with it as it's progressed through the franchise, but I'm guessing there's some managerial side to it. And then I know that they've obviously sectioned out the Football Manager side of that to an even crazier game. And Football Manager is an even more relevant example. But the other example that I was going to use is Civilization. So heavy strategy, like lots of little decisions and reading and understanding game systems and blah, 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 all on top of each other. But you wouldn't say that FIFA is a bad game. And you wouldn't say that Civilization are bad games because they're just not for everybody. You would say not everyone will like this, but if you like Civilization, well, here's what I think about Civilization and whether or not you would like it or not. That's how you kind of approach the review cycle. With this game, with Death Stranding, I think a lot of people went into this not thinking about it as okay, let's review this game on its merits of what it is. I think a lot of people went into this game being this game is garbage and this is how I feel about it. And that means that I'm going to put out this crazy review that's saying that it's a terrible game, when really it's one of those things where it's just a matter of this game isn't for everyone. It's a niche title that has very specific, very system-heavy mechanics that some people will like and some people will just bounce off it. And if you bounce off it, that's great. I hate sports games. I can't tell you why I don't like sports games. They have everything in it that I should like. They're system intense. They're like the same thing over and over again. You can control different bits and pieces of them. Like you can do the managerial side and stuff like that. But I don't like them because they're sports. There's no fantasy element to them. I don't like that. Okay, that's not for me. But I really like Death Stranding. And I think it's okay to say not everyone will like it, but I did. What did I like about it, though? Let's get off this train of what other people thought and talk about what I liked about it. It is a system-driven game that is just so tight. I think the systems in this game are so tight and so well constructed and so well thought out that they all come together to be this really interesting, really different experience of gameplay that we haven't seen before in this way that it's constructed, and particularly we haven't seen it out of a AAA studio. There's elements from lots of different games in here. The game itself has some third-person shooter elements. The game itself has some, like it's got some vehicle elements in it. It's got some traversal elements in it. It's got grenades in it. It's got story stuff and blah, blah, blah. So it's not like it's doing something completely new. It's one of those things where obviously we have a lot of video game literacy that has been built up over time, and it's using a lot of that. Like, you're not going to pick this game up and be like, oh my God, I've never played this game and I don't know what to do with it. But it does bring a lot of new stuff to the table. So let's talk about the gameplay. Let's talk about what's awesome, because it really kind of comes down to the gameplay is what I really liked and the story is what I didn't. So let's talk about the gameplay. The gameplay is phenomenal, in my opinion. Basically, the way that I describe it is it's come down to kind of like 3 parts, 4 parts, depending on how you want to describe it. And this is probably going to ruin a script that I've been writing and then getting rid of because it's garbage, and then rewriting and then getting rid of, that talks about like the gameplay. So kind of ruining maybe a future video. But it kind of comes down to this sort of 3-section thing. The core game loop is you will take on an order because you're a delivery man. Everybody has probably said that about this game. If you're watching this video, you're probably familiar with it. You're a delivery man. You deliver packages from outpost to outpost on your way across America, trying to rebuild America from its broken state. And there's some other story motivation stuff in there. For example, there's company or like organization or government branch called Bridges, and Bridges is responsible for rebuilding the continent. And a while ago, Bridges sent out an expedition to cross the country and to link up the states from the first expedition was to build outposts and things across the country. And now you are part of Bridges 2, the second expedition, and your job is to go across the country from East Coast to West Coast and connect all of these outposts that have been built to what's called the chiral network. And the chiral network is this kind of like stand-in for the internet, metaphorically, essentially, but it's this network that runs on the power that kind of comes in through all of the crazy wacky space beaches stuff that's in the game. But it connects people to a network that gives them the opportunity to access information that Bridges has and share things. They can use things called chiral printers, which are basically like 3D printers that let them print gear and get schematics and that kind of thing. And so your job is to go across the country and deliver packages to help people connect to the chiral network and to just basically build everybody up. And so most of the game is you'll get an order and then you'll need to construct your inventory. A good portion of the game happens in this stage. It's the inventory management system. And the way that I would describe this is you take on an order, and then one of the most important things that you do is you build your house of cards as of all of the different things that you can take with you in this game. And there are all sorts of different things that you can do, but basically, depending on what your order is, and there's a ton of different things that will affect how your order plays out, there are different container sizes. The different container sizes take up different amount of space on your back, and depending on what the order is, you might have lots of light containers, you might have one really heavy container, you might have lots of heavy containers, you might have lots of tiny containers that weigh a medium amount. There's like the size of the containers, the weight of the containers. There's things with like how fragile they are. There's other things like sometimes the direction that they have to lay on the backpack. There's all sorts of different things that can affect them, like time limits on the orders. And then there's equipment. And the equipment is things like ladders and climbing ropes and repair spray to make your containers less damaged from different environmental things. And so you have an equipment sort of element to this inventory management thing that you do when you take on an order. And obviously there's lots to that, but once you've finished this kind of inventory management thing, you've set up this house of cards. It's a giant house of cards with all these different things that are all kind of sitting on top of each other and whatever, because you are about to go out into the wilderness and try and deliver these things. And how you've managed your inventory will largely dictate how you go in the world. Anyway, once you've done that, you go out into the world. And this is where most of the time in the game is spent. And it's awesome. The game world is really, really well realized. It's an amazing gameplay space for most of like what I've seen of it. There's all sorts of different types of terrain. So you start off in an area that's mostly grass flats with just some rocks and some little streams. And later on in the game, you get to more mountainous areas. You get to areas that are covered with BTs, which are the like main antagonists for the game, obviously, which are these kind of like spectral spirit ghost things that will really bugger up your playthrough, because they basically knock all your stuff off your backpack and then drag you away from all of your stuff if you get caught by them. And then you have to do a small boss fight where you fight like a giant panther BT or a giant shark BT or something like that. And there's more to that system, but it's not that important. You don't bump into it that much. But there's other bits and pieces. So like there's an area that has lots of different kind of level changes of flat rock. There's an area where there's lots of big I don't know what you would call them, but they're like chasms in the area. So you can kind of like, you can't run flat across this area, and most of it's too wide to put ladders down, but there's this winding kind of network of chasms that run between it. So you kind of have to work out how you're going to get across these chasms. Do you go down into them and try and work your way through the labyrinth, or do you try and jump over them in your vehicles, that sort of thing? So there's all these different kinds of terrain types. And then you have all of your systems that Sam has to try and help you. So you've got your equipment to try and help you get over those things. So if you need to go up a mountain, you've got ladders. If you need to go down a mountain, you've got the climbing rope. Later on in the game, you unlock all sorts of other things to help you out with that sort of thing. And then there's all the other systems which push back against you and your equipment. So there's things like your balance. You've probably seen a million things about people falling over or just dropping their cargo everywhere. It's kind of hilarious. You have one of those like immense moments of frustration, and then your packages just go everywhere and you can't help but laugh. Although I guess some people probably had that happen over and over and over again. It just became an immense amount of frustration. But you put all your packages on, and you've got boot degradation. Your BB needs to be taken care of. So if you don't if you do something that's a little bit too aggressive, your BB, which is the unit that's on your chest, the baby in the bottle, that helps you detect BTs. And it has basically a life gauge, which is how toxic It's called autotoxemia, and if it gets unhappy, it will basically start crying, and that bar will decrease, and you need to kind of take it off your chest and like rock it. You're supposed to rock it back and forth, but it kind of looks ridiculous. You can shake it up and down, and that counts. The animation's pretty funny, but so like it has a life bar. You have a stamina gauge which slowly depletes as you do more and more stuff, and it will permanently reduce its max, and then within that it has the stamina that you've used. So you'll deplete it as you do things like run, as you do things like get into streams that take a lot of stamina and that sort of stuff. So its maximum is depleting, plus the amount that bar is like the amount of the actual bar itself is going down as you do strenuous activities. And that's something that you need to manage. You've got to manage the balancing, obviously, left and right. You need to manage the different terrain types. So if you're on loose gravel, or if you're on something that's like very, very uneven surfaces, you have a higher chance of losing your balance, which will then make you have to regain your balance more often, which is a pain in the ass. If you have lots and lots of cargo, then it makes it more difficult because you are overbalanced much more easily, and then you run into obviously this like cascading problem of you overbalance more easily, which means it's more difficult if you're going over rough terrain, which means that you're going to have to try and balance yourself more, which generally will mean that you'll fall over and drop your cargo more, which generally will mean that there's more cargo damage that happens, and so you kind of have to plan a different route around that, or you have to plan a different way of organizing your cargo so that it's different. This probably all sounds terrible. Like I'm probably not doing it a good justice. But you have all these systems that kind of push back against you, and you just have to get from A to B. And the game does an excellent job of making every single part of that journey gameplay. One of the things I think a lot of people didn't like is this idea that you have to like constantly balance yourself back and forth. And it's interesting because I thought it was actually really, really cool and a useful way to kind of fill in that dead space that's in most games. Because when you think about most games, they have something like you go from here to the next place by running from point A to point B. But point A to point B, that journey is dead time normally. And developers try and fill it in with like, oh, you can find a chest, or oh, maybe there's some platforming and stuff. But really, it's tiny little segments of gameplay, like jump from here to here, run for a bit, jump from here to here, run for a bit. And each jump would have been a little segment of gameplay with just completely low risk gameplay in between. This game kind of tries to make all of the gameplay. You're constantly needing to like look ahead of you so that you can see what terrain's coming up and pick your route through the even just a few rocks on the ground. You're probably going to want to go between them, not over the top of them like you would in a game like Skyrim, where you just be jumping, bashing on the jump button, being like jump, 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 running forward like W space, 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 and just jumping over rocks and stuff. You need to go around them because you have a ton of cargo. You don't want to overbalance. It's much easier that way. And so you've kind of got this like little short loop of like check your stamina, look ahead of you, find out where you're going. And then every once in a while you'll have to look up and be like, okay, so I'm going around these rocks like this, but then once I sort of go around these rocks like this, where am I actually headed? Am I going in the right direction? I need to head for that big rise over there. And so there's that kind of medium term loop of being like, okay, I'm doing my close vision stuff. I'm heading over there. And then once I get there, where am I going to go? So there's another level to that. There's kind of, because of the way they've put together these movement mechanics, there's all of these little tiny like considerations that you have to make all the time. Am I overbalancing? No. Am I going to overbalance? Yes. Okay, so I need to go around here. Okay, cool. Maybe I should slow down so I don't overbalance. Okay, now I can keep going. Cool. I'm heading to that rock over there. Sweet. I'm a little bit away from there. From there, I'm going to have to go over to that place there, most likely. So maybe I should consider doing something different. There's a package on the ground. So this is a side point that I haven't brought up yet. You occasionally will find packages out in the world, and they might be resources or they might be things that need to be delivered. So that's another thing that you kind of bump into and be like, okay, I've set up my house of cards of all the equipment and packages that I need to bring and the route that I'm going to take and all that. Oh, here's another package on the ground that's valuable to me. How do I fit this into my now House of Cards, try and put another thing on top, maybe. Let's see how it falls down. Oh, it's not going to. It should be all right for now. Like, you bump into things and you're like, fuck, do I want to leave that? That's really useful. Or I'm just near the weather station and this needs to be delivered to the weather station, but I'm already pretty full and I'm kind of overbalancing a lot as it is. All these tiny little decisions that you have to make are all gameplay, and they're all making you more engaged with the systems. I know that element probably put a lot of people off, and it's maybe it's putting you off, and that's fine. That is what I think makes the game really awesome, though. It's this constantly engaging cycle of tiny little loops that build up on top of bigger loops, that build up on top of giant loops, that is all this kind of consideration of just getting like a package that's got fossilized dung in it from point A to point B. It's the fact that you're doing just package delivery is kind of undermining all of the systems and the gameplay and whatnot that goes into it. And I think a lot of people like a lot of people will write it off just because it's package delivery. If you were delivering the wand of Aknamoresh, of the fallen wizard of Aknamoresh left in the blah, and then like I think if you had something kind of ridiculous like that, people wouldn't write it off nearly as much, but it's not that. It's package delivery. And that feeds into the metaphors of all the games play stuff that we'll talk about in the story later. But that is what I really like about the game. And there's all these different ways to kind of approach the situations that you bump into. You can try to sneak around BTs, or you can try and sneak through the BTs. If you sneak through the BTs, you have to throw grenades and things at you, and that gives you another thing to manage because most of the weapons that you use against the BTs will also use blood and your own blood. And so you need to manage the amount of blood that you have versus the amount of weapon, so, for example, if you have one container of grenades, it has 5 grenades in it, but you might go through a field of 20, 30 BTs, so you need to have 5 containers of grenades, but that's all space. And you need to think about that before you go on the trip, because if you leave without any grenades, then you make it halfway through the delivery, and now you've got a field of BTs in front of you, and you're not equipped to handle that. That's all what I found so interesting about the game, is that you had to forward think all of these things and be like, okay, well, I need to take a gun with me so I can shoot some BTs, but I also need to make sure that I have enough container spray because I'm going into timefall, which is rain that will deteriorate the condition of your packages, basically. And so you have container spray that will repair the containers that hold the packages, that hold the cargo, or however you want to describe it, things that are getting delivered. You need to think about that, and then you need to be like, okay, cool. And so that's where I was kind of talking about this house of cards that you're building. You're thinking about all these different things ahead of you and trying to bring enough equipment with you, and then maybe you can't go through that field of BT, so you need to work your way around. Or maybe you've got a bike, and the bikes have their own limitations. The bikes can only have a certain amount of stuff put on them. And so if you've got a really, really, really heavy order, like in the mid to late game, a bike isn't going to do the job. So you have other tools that will make the job slower, or other tools that will make the job quicker but are much more difficult to kind of maneuver around, such as a truck or these little floating carrier things. And that's all the interesting part of the game. It's you walk into a distribution center or one of these places, and you say, okay, what's on the list? Which direction am I going now? And you look at all the orders and you're like, yeah, okay, cool. I think I can get this one, and this one in that rough general direction, and I reckon I can deliver them all in this one go. And it's funny. On Twitter, I saw it described as Death Stranding is the guys trying to take all of the groceries in from the car in one go, the video game. And I'm just like, that is such a good metaphor, because that's exactly what you're doing. You look at all the orders and you're like, I want to take as much as possible, as many of these orders as possible to their destinations, because you get rewarded basically for delivering orders to their destination. And you look at them all and you try and Tetris all of the orders into your your backpack and your floating carriers or your vehicle or whatever you've decided is the best way to do this. And each different set of orders will present different restrictions. And then you go out in the world and you kind of just hope that you did a good job. You hope that you have enough equipment to get you through. You've planned ahead for areas that you may know or areas that you might not, but you've done your best. And then it's all up to just kind of what happens out in the world. And then you're either going to get to your destination and sometimes it's a clutch last minute get there and you run low on stamina, and sometimes you've planned well and you're just going to roll over the finish line easy peasy because you did enough planning and you did the right thing. And if not, that's cool. There's also like a third person element to this game. There's some obstacles in the world called mules, or later on in the game they're terrorists, which are basically NPCs that will chase down the player and attack them and try and steal their packages and that sort of stuff. And this plays into some of the other story stuff later on as well, where there's some third-person mechanics and some combat sections that require guns, essentially. And the third-person part of this game is not good. It's not particularly well designed. I played through on the PS4. Obviously, Death Stranding had all that kerfuffle about then also coming out on PC further down the track. On the PS4, the aiming systems are just terrible. Like trying to aim with a stick and also use these like pretty bad third-person systems, it's real tough. It's real tough because they have sort of an auto aim, but kind of not really. And you know, maybe if you fiddled with the sensitivity a little bit, it would help. But they feel sluggish, and there's not a lot of feedback when you hit something. So you're not sure whether you should just like lay bullets into them or whether you should like hit them once and then they take damage and then they kind of got an invincibility period. There's a lot of that kind of stuff it's just not done well. The guns feel like garbage because you can't aim them properly. There's different types of guns and they all seem to use blood. So there's an extra resource that you kind of have to manage there, but at least there isn't ammo on top of all the other things that you have to manage. And blood's pretty easy to manage because there's a thing called blood bags that you can get. They're pretty cheap and they basically are an extra extension to the amount of blood that you have, including in your body, and that will use your blood bags first. So you normally just carry around 5 blood bags in your utility pouch, which is tons and tons and tons of blood. But that part is not particularly good. And then there's all of the social multiplayer stuff. So you're doing your orders, you're building up your like little castle of cards, hoping that you're going to make it to the next destination and you're going to have the best run. But then there's also the social side of that with the Strand type gameplay. Now, Kojima's like, this is a Strand type game. It's the first game of its type. It's not. It's just plain not. Dark Souls has done stuff like this before, like Demon Souls before that, I believe, had some similar things to this. There's been elements of this kind of stuff in games before, like tons of times, little elements, little bits and pieces, but it is a cool concept. And what Kojima at Kojima Productions and all of the other hundreds of people that probably work there, maybe not hundreds, but all of the other developers that make up what Kojima Productions is to help Kojima make games like this, what they've done with the social multiplayer systems is really, really interesting. So you probably know how they work. You go out maybe you need to cross a river. And so you get a ladder out and you put the ladder down to cross the river so that you don't have to get in the water. And that ladder is now persistent within your world, but it will show up in other people's worlds that are connected with you. So you have this interesting like dynamic of you're putting down things maybe to help you, but also with the knowledge that they probably will help other people. And so you do kind of little things like you might, instead of just being like, this is where I am at the river, I've hit it here, I'm going to put this down and then I'm going to keep going even though I could go over these rocks. You might run down the river 200 meters somewhere where it's going to be a much better crossing, or where you think more players might pop out. Like maybe you went a really crap route and just next to you, you're like, oh, over there is actually a much better way to go. I'll go and put my ladder down there. And so then you put your ladder down knowing kind of full well that other players might see this ladder in the position that you then put it. So you're kind of considering other people when you're doing this stuff. And then the other side of that is that obviously you bump into other people's stuff. You bump into things that other people have put down that they have left lying around. And so you might be really struggling to get up a cliff or something, or you might be heading for a mountain and knowing full well that there's going to be a difficult time getting up that, and someone's left a climbing rope, and you're like, oh yeah, fuck yeah, climbing rope is the best shit, yeah, woo. And you then don't have to have such a hard time climbing that mountain. Or maybe there's some other stuff that you do, like the ladders across the rivers, the different vehicles that you can collect from different distribution centers and cities. So people basically, if they leave their bike in their garage, some of those will show up to other players to be able to get out of the garage. It doesn't take the vehicle off the person that owns it, but it just like has this kind of collective multiplayer thing where if someone else has built a bike and put it in here, well, you can pull it out and use it as a bike without having to build your own bike, or without having to have driven your own bike there and stored it yourself. All sorts of stuff. Later on in the game, there's these things called zip lines. Like, they kind of break the game a little bit, but basically they allow you to zip line between 2 points that you can see with line of sight that's within 300 meters of each other. And so they're a tool, I believe, that's basically been put in the game to make sections that are mountainous, where it's really difficult to climb up. You're trudging through snow, you're fighting your stamina bar, you're fighting BTs and things like that. Like, all of that, I believe it's so that, like, once you connect them people that you're going to the chiral network, you have an easy way to get back without having to fight the environment all the way back again. But you can kind of cheese that a little bit by making a network of zip lines that run between everything that allow you to skip giant sections of the traversal element of the game. But by that point, you've been traversing so much that I think it's, while I can sort of see both sides of that coin, it's good, because you still, each time you take on a new mission, you still have to traverse. So yeah, anyway, getting sidetracked with all the stuff that you can do. The multiplayer elements are really, really interesting. In particular, I spent so much time building roads. So roads in this game basically are like, they're predetermined spots that just have like what's called a printer. And you take resources to this printer and then you dump them inside. And once the printer has enough resources, it will just build a road. It's a preset specific spot. You can't pick where to build your road, unlike you can pick where you build a lot of your other things like post boxes and watchtowers and zip lines and stuff. But you don't pick where this road goes. But there's each of these different little printers that are scattered across the land give you a particular piece of road that kind of connects the world through all of these networks. I had so much fun building these roads. These roads are one of those things that are like, this is one of the things that I think I went, and part of the reason that I enjoyed probably the game so much is these roads make a massive difference, because when you're running back and forth over all of this terrain, you're just like, oh my God, this is the most frustrating thing in the world. And so when you build a road and you can skip a portion of that, similar to what the zip line is like, but obviously the roads have the restriction of being specifically where the developers put them, it's great. And where the roads are, you're not skipping past gameplay segments, because to be able to build the roads in the first place, you need to either get a giant, ridiculous amount of resources to that spot to build the road, or you have to have traversed past it to connect it to the chiral network and then see whether someone else has built the road for you. And so, like, I spent a ton of time going around to all the different camps on the map that have like giant piles of resources, stockpiling them in a truck, driving them across the continent, dumping them into a chiral printer that would then print a road, which might be like a section that's like 200 meters long. And then I'd be like, hell yeah, that's awesome. And it's a really good way to get likes, which is kind of, people are using the term currency. Likes aren't really a currency, because you can give out as many as you want and receive as many as you want, and that's literally all they're for. They're just there as like this weird kind of like pat on the back thing. You can't use them for anything. Like, you can't be like, I'm gonna buy that bicycle for 100,000 likes or whatever. It's not how it works. You just kind of collect them. It's like it's a number to say how much help you were, I guess. And you get a bunch of likes from roads. You get a lot of likes from roads, but mainly they're helpful. They're super helpful because you can then drive between different things. So you can drive from a city to a distribution center and then from a distribution center to the next city in a truck without having to get out, where previously, obviously, you'd be able to go a little bit, but then you might have to get out and get all this stuff and put it on your back and then climb over a mountain. And like, the roads help with that sort of stuff so much. And there's a particular part at the end of the game that means a lot of people basically bumped into this thing. I don't know. I'll talk about it at the end of the story. I'm going to talk about the story section in a second. We'll talk about it at the end of the story. But, these roads are awesome. They help so much. And you get this real sense of community and, like, giving as you're building them, and they're also selfish because they're helping you make your delivery so much easier. And it becomes one of these things, I honestly believe, where the more time you put into building out these social features and this social multiplayer stuff, and like putting lots of ladders down and building roads and building zip lines and throwing down post boxes and things like that, the more fun you're going to have with the game, because building up that network of stuff, particularly the roads and the zip lines, mean that when you then have to engage with the game's systems, like doing deliveries to max out one particular person's like outpost to then get the benefits that maxing out process gives you, you can take advantage of all that work that you put in building roads and zip lines and post office boxes and all that sort of stuff. But if you just rush through the game, you're going to hit a hard wall every time you need to do anything, because you're then fighting the environment every single time. Anyway, we've spent enough time talking about that sort of stuff. I quickly want to touch on the level design. The level design is amazing. The level design in this is great. There's so many times where you look at something and you're just like, oh my God, that is like an insurmountable, ridiculous, obstacle. And then you kind of work your way towards it and you realize, no, actually, this is a very considered gameplay space that someone has thought about. And if you explore around the outside of it, maybe there's a way that you can see is clearly the way that you're supposed to go up here, and there's a section like over here that's clearly supposed to allow you to get around here if you've got this particular tool. The more that you look at the spaces, the more you realize how much crazy effort has gone into making these spaces like puzzles in themselves. Yeah, you have to climb over a mountain, but it's not like someone's just gone terrain generate mountain stamp. Every single piece is a very considered space. One example is there's a small area at the start, which is probably the first maybe between 5 and 10 hours, depending on how crazy you are with the amount of work that you do and the amount of deliveries that you do. And then after that, the world opens up into a much, much bigger space, which is pretty much the rest of the map. Like star, T's and C's, but pretty much the rest of the map, and it's a much, much bigger area. The first thing that you basically do is you have to take 3 packages to 3 different people. 2 of them are kind of like on ground level, what I'll call ground level. You know, there's some hills and bits and pieces. But then one of them is up on this like raised plateau that when you walk outside of the city that you get these orders from, you look over and you think, oh God, it's a giant plateau. And you're like, oh, I don't want to do this. Okay, cool. And for me, like, I went and did the other 2 orders first, and I put it off and I put it off and I did a bunch of orders and I did this and I did that. And the first time I played through the game, I've played through this section twice. I haven't played through the whole game twice, but I played through this section twice. The first time I was like, oh, all right. And then once I got over there, I realized this has very distinct spots that are supposed to be areas where you will get up here. And one of them is very easy, but it's guarded by those human NPCs that I mentioned before, the mules. So you kind of have to make your way through a bunch of mule territory that's hostile to this fairly easy way of getting up on top of this plateau. Or you can go around the other way, and there's sort of like a bit of a hidden area, but it's hidden next to a stream. So if you looked at it from a distance, you'd be like, oh, I can see that there's a chasm there's a cut out area in that plateau. Maybe that's a ramp. And then as you get a bit closer to it, you realize, oh, that's a river. There's a river there. Maybe I'll be able to walk up the bank of the river and get a little bit further up onto this plateau, and maybe that'll make my job a little bit easier before I have to really start employing all of this crazy equipment. And then this is actually where I would have preferred them to not have done this. But when you get closer again, you then realize just next to that, you can't walk up the river because it's a tight space on either side with water running through it, like a cliff on either side with water running through down the middle. And so trying to do that you'll drain your stamina down and you'll be having a bad time. But sort of just a little bit to the right of that, there's this area that kind of carves around the outside of this plateau and makes its way up to this hump. You go around and then you climb up this hump, and then you can drop down into this other area. This is hopefully making sense, which then leads you up to the top of the plateau. So it's one of those things where like this, and that continues throughout the entire game. You look at this giant snowy mountain range that you have to go over, and you'll be like, oh, Jesus, this is going to be really difficult. This is going to be a lot of work, and I'm going to hate this. And then you kind of like open your map, you look at the terrain from the top. You say, oh, okay, I think I can probably go from here to here. I know how to easily get here. I've done this a million times. And then from there, I can go up into this snowy section here. And then it looks like I could probably get through from here to here. And so you try it out, and you realize that these spaces are designed in this way so that if someone was to like really look at it like that and have a look at the map and be like, okay, try and plan a route through here, there is easily a possibility of them doing that. And then like that space in particular is like that you've got like green on one side, green on other, and a giant snowy mountain in the middle, and you have to get from one side to the other with a pretty difficult package. And there's one giant channel that is super obvious on the map that you're supposed to go through. Supposed to go through. It's a game that's got quite a bit of freedom to it, but like you can see that it's clearly designed that this is a pass between the mountain and the two areas on either side of it. But just next to that are these sort of other little tiny passes that you wouldn't notice going through that big pass. But then later on in the game, there's a mission that you pick up that you have to go to a different outpost, and that little outpost takes advantage of those little passes. And so then you look at it and you're like, oh, that section kind of connects back in with next to that pass that I was looking at before, but I didn't see it before because I was going through with the intention of going here. But now that I'm coming back through here, oh, okay, there's an area there where, okay, I'll go through here. And then it's full of BTs and you're like, God damn it. But it's very considered. There's a ton of like really, really good stuff in the level design that I think probably got completely overlooked because it is all just designed to look obviously as much like terrain, just a random terrain as possible. It's supposed to just look like mountains and rocks and channels and chasms and streams and that sort of stuff. And that's all through the game. I won't keep talking about it, but that's all through the game. Like there's areas that run between different things so that it's a bit easier once you know what you're doing. And there's other areas where like once you've traversed a thing, you can then look back and be like, oh, okay, I can see how I would have gone through here. Or the other thing is once you connect to the chiral network, it will show you paths of where other players have gone. And so then you can sort of follow those and be like, oh, okay, I can see where people have sort of gone, and I wonder if this way will be easier or that way will be easier. Oh, you can get through there. Yeah. Good stuff. What have I got down here on my notes? I think that's pretty much everything for the gameplay stuff that I kind of wanted to talk about. The one other thing that I'll say is just like this game's marketing was genius. To basically knowing full well that they were doing a game that was going to be not particularly well received at all, because it's on the surface level, and even after some people played it, they didn't like it. But on the surface level, it's like a postman pat delivery simulator, and like, you know, postman kind of game where you deliver packages. And if you went to like a marketing firm was like, I've got a video game where you deliver packages and I spent $100 million making it, you would just be like laughed out of the building most likely. And so instead they kind of went with this crazy, what is this game? What are you doing? Oh my God, it's so crazy. It's so out there. It's very Kojima. Totally ran with Kojima's like particular style of just doing crazy nonsense stuff in order to market it. But it really, really worked. I think it did a really good job because lots of people bought this. As far as I'm aware, it's been a pretty big success. And it's just different. It's just nice to see something that's different, that's not Call of Duty except in space, or Call of Duty except in the ice place, or fucking any Ubisoft open world game where you fucking find towers and then you're like, yeah, towers, that unlocked part of the map, and now I have to do fucking outposts. Oh my God. And like, if you do an outpost, you collect one of 6 different types of collectibles. But if you get all of the collectibles, you get mega. Oh my God. Any of that kind of open world design. It's just so nice to see something completely different. Anyway, let's talk about the story. Let's do a bitch sesh about that stuff. So, Death Stranding has a story. There's definitely story stuff in Death Stranding. I would describe it as a story that is intriguing. It's interesting. The world that Kojima has set up is interesting. Ultimately, I don't think it's very well delivered, and I don't think it pays off very well at all, like in the slightest. There are elements that are really well done. There are elements in it that like I'll describe later down the track that I think are well done. But oh my God, the story of content of this game just so it's, yeah, I don't know. I'm going to try and not spoil anything. So let's just quickly go over kind of like the premise and what I thought about it. And then I'll say spoilers and then we can talk about spoilers. This video is already getting pretty long. If you're still listening, oh, Jesus, thanks so much. You're an absolute champion considering most of this is just rambling. So the story in this game centers around Sam Porter Bridges. Sam is not particularly good with people, doesn't like people, has a bunch of character things that like get set up early, like he doesn't like to be touched and he's a bit gruff and he doesn't like Bridges and just wants to stick to himself and do his little packaging delivery as an independent dude. And he kind of gets thrust into this world through people that he knew and people and events that happen to him, of needing to reconnect the chiral network like we described before, go across the country as bridges to connect the chiral network to all the places that the chiral network needs to be connected to, and basically skipping through 2 hours of cutscenes at the start of the game, which we'll talk about in a second. The purpose is basically his personal motivation is to go and save his sister, who is being held by terrorists on the West Coast. And the external motivation is to kind of like both do that and connect bridges. The way that his sister has said is the best way to save him is to go across the country and connect all these people up to the chiral network. And then once he gets to Edge Knot City, he'll be able to save her. And so you kind of do that. That's your motivation. That's the character motivation to go and do stuff. There's a whole bunch of world building and introduction stuff that happens before that. Sweet. That's a thing. So I think one of the cutscenes that came out as a trailer was one of the really early cutscenes. You kind of like you bump into Fragile very early on. That was a cutscene that was part of the marketing material. You then basically go down the hill and you get enlisted to deliver a corpse to the incinerator. That goes badly, and then that spurs in this motion of having to then, like you wake up, you have some problems with the president of the United States, which is someone who cared for you when you were young. It turns out Amelie is the perfect person to replace her, but she's stuck with the terrorists in Edge Knot, and so off you go to save her. And then you kind of get dug into all this other stuff. And the thing is, the story has so so little relevance to anything that you do in the gameplay, which is part of the reason that I say that I love this game, but I hate the gameplay. Oh, sorry, I hate that I not. I don't hate. I really, hate. Let's just go with that. I hate the story. It's super intriguing to begin with. You're like, okay, cool. There's this crazy world. There's all this stuff that's set up. I need to get across the country to save my sister. There's, they're slowly folding in other things while that sounds like a long-term goal, and it is. And there's other things that you're folding in while you're doing that. There's the BB, and so you have to take the BB up the hill very early on in the game in like the first kind of 2 or 3, probably let's say hour of actual gameplay. You have to take the BB up the hill, and they're like, you need to destroy it. And, you're kind of like, well, I don't really want to destroy it. And then some BTs come and you have to kind of use it to get out of that situation. And so you've folded in these elements of the BTs, and you've folded in these elements of the BB into the story, and those kind of short-term stories that unfold while you're doing the long-term story of getting across the country to save Amelie. The story itself is bricked into episodes, and each episode, I'm going to say, from what I remember, is actually fairly well constructed. The episodes themselves are they follow a fairly good structure of the 3-act structure from writing screenplays and novels, and that 3-act structure that most stories are built on, most films are built on. They kind of have this introduction, you have a task that you need to do, there's a twist or something to it, and then you kind of end up with a climax at the end of each of the episodes. And they are fairly well constructed, even if each individual one isn't necessarily the best thing. The arc for the entire story is just trash. Like you're getting dragged along with all this setup, all this stuff's getting set up, all these different bits and pieces are getting set up. And then what ends up happening is the payoff at the end of that shows you that nothing that you did mattered. Like all of this intrigue has been built up and then just doesn't pay off because it just decides to do like a knee-jerk change, and then all this other stuff gets dumped on you, and it's just crazy and Kojima batshit nonsense. And it's all kind of trying to be this really deep metaphoric thing. And I know a lot of people are going to be like, oh, well, you just didn't get it. You just didn't get Kojima's genius. He's a genius, and you just didn't get it. But genuinely, I didn't, okay? I didn't get it. I feel like the metaphors were all there, buried on top of other metaphors, like a pile of bodies, none of which are actually achieving their goals in life because they're all just crushed underneath the weight of all of the other metaphors that are trying to get made in this game. And it ends up being this thing where you play through all this stuff and just none of it matters because of the way it plays out. Anyway, let's stop talking about it like that, because I need to talk about spoilers, because this is just rambling nonsense trying not to spoil stuff for people. But so if you're really worried about spoilers, let's call this the spoiler warning. If you're not really worried about spoilers, let's continue on. All good. So each individual episode is focused around a character. And so the first one is sort of focused around, Bridget. And the prologue is, the prologue. So that all kind of leads up to Bridget. And then Bridget dies at the start of the game. And Bridget is the president lady, and she's having trouble and she dies. And then the next one is, I forget who the next one is. The next one is focused around kind of, just Sam and the baby and the BBs and some stuff. And then the third one is focused around Amelie and kind of working out what Amelie is. And then later on in the game, there's one with Deadman. Further down the track, there's a couple of different chapters that are around stuff with Cliff, who is Mads Mikkelsen's character. There's one further down the track with Hartman, who is the character that has the defibrillator from the different trailers and things like that. He has a couple, at least one that's very, very well done structurally, but is just nonsense content-wise. And I found it intriguing. until just I'm just so frustrated by this story. Even talking about it is difficult. So I hope you can hear the frustration. Trying to just think about how I'm even going to approach this is just ridiculous. Even after the spoiler warning's gone down. Oh my god. Okay. So basically the game is like, it sets up all these different mysteries. It's like, you know, what are the BBs? Oh, let's dig into what was the BB project? How did that happen? Who's this guy? This crazy stuff just went down and I ended up in this like alternate reality thing. I'm not even fucking kidding. This is legitimately what happens in the game. You end up in this alternate reality thing, and there's this Mads Mikkelsen character guy who's got skeleton warriors who are chasing after you, and you've got to shoot them, and then you've got to kill him, and then that puts you back in real reality, and you're like, oh my god, what was that? And the characters are all like, oh, well, you've only been gone for 40 seconds, and he's like, I was definitely gone for longer than 40 seconds, and then you get to the end. You do all this stuff, right? The main part of the game is basically like the first part, which is really good, really self-contained, awesome. It's the first act essentially, you know. So it's probably going to be pretty good, and it is. It's fine. You do a bunch of deliveries and blah blah blah. You go through to the main map, which is that area where I was mentioning before. That the world goes from being small to much much bigger, and you do a whole bunch of stuff. You kind of, you know, you're constructing the chiral network, you're doing stuff, you're making friends with like, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Leah Sado? Is that her name? But Fragile. Her character in the game is called Fragile. You're making awesome friends with her. You know, Fragile's trying to be super nice, and Sam keeps pushing back, and they slowly get closer and closer together throughout the story. You're bumping into like Higgs. You're learning about Higgs. Higgs is Troy Baker's character. He's kind of like the main antagonist of the game, and you learn about him and his relationship with stuff and where he came from and kind of like why he's sort of doing what he's doing. And then you get to the end of the game, and the end of the game where it's like really end stuff happens is like everything funnels down into this kind of like section where you've got to do a bunch of stuff, and some of it is cool. There's a kind of cool, interesting piece of gameplay where like you get right to the tip of the continent and they're like, you need to get across this giant tar pit. And and the solution for that is that you have to get caught by a BT so that you get dragged out into this tar pit. And then you can traverse the tar pit by using the buildings that come up out of the tar whenever you get caught by a BT, which is an interesting, cool mechanic. And then you jump across all these buildings and you get to the other side of the tar pit, and there's like an extra section where you basically get and connect the last station, and then you have to do a just dumb fucking boss fight, against like your captured sister Amelie, who's been like kind of captured but kind of held prisoner, but also not really, by Higgs. And sure, it's not well explained. It just kind of happens. It gets thrown on the player. And then you go back to the main area, and they're like, okay, now you need to like, chiral stuff's going crazy. There's these things in the game called chiral storms. It's thunderstorms that are bad, essentially. Just ignore it. But basically, they're like, there's lots of thunderstorms that are bad and stuff going on, and you need to make your way back across the entire continent. Now, most people, when they found this out, at least that I've heard in different reviews and things like, were like, fuck the entire continent. This comes back to what I said before. If you put in the effort to engage with social systems, to engage with other players, to help them out, to put down zip lines, to help yourself out, to like do this weird thing that's like selfish but also selfless but also mostly selfish, to like build a network of zip lines and roads and stuff, you will breeze back. You'll be like, fuck yeah. And for me, I'd put all that work in the first time I played through the game. So I had this awesome experience of going back along all of the stuff that I built and kind of like you see the grandeur of the work that you put in because you're asked to go back across all of it. So I pretty much got back on the tip of the continent, the very other side of the map that I needed to be, and they're like, go back across the entire map. And I was like, hell yeah, this is going to be easy peasy. And then I just jumped on my network of zip lines, got to the end, jumped in a truck, drove across the country. It was great. I was like, all of my work is paying off. This is phenomenal. Like, you can see all of this work that I put in is finally paying off, and this is great. And if you didn't put any of that work in, you were going to have a bad time because those storms just made it a pain. From memory, the storms make it so that the BT bosses that you would normally bump into if you got caught by BTs just appear randomly on the map. They just appear randomly. And if you haven't got roads, driving around those things is probably really, really difficult. If you've got roads, you just drive past them. They appear out of nowhere. You drive past them. But anyway, you can see why that would be frustrating probably to you and a lot of other people. They're basically like, okay, now go back across the entire map to the start. You fight a space whale. I'm not even fucking kidding you. You for no reason, this has no, there's no reason in the story to fight this monster. It's you go pretty much all the way back to the Star City. You get just outside the Start City, and you just end up in a BT fight. Like, you just end up in a fight against a BT. And, like, maybe it's in the game. Maybe I missed it, okay? Maybe it's just that I don't understand Kojima. But, like, maybe it's a pacing thing. Maybe they're like, well, you're about to deal with a whole bunch of cutscenes and stuff like that, so let's put, like, a climactic gameplay segment right before this so that you've exhausted all that tension. You're really, really tense and pent up, and then you kind of like beat the boss and you're like, okay. And then you kind of primed to have a bit of a low point and watch a bunch of cutscenes. But the gameplay in this, it's not a good boss fight. It unfortunately suffers from that problem that people have where, not people, but like that it suffers from that end game problem where the amount of effort that they put into the start of the game is the most because everybody who starts the game has to play through the stuff at the start of the game. The stuff at the end, most people aren't going to play, particularly probably in Death Stranding because it's 70 hours and most people find it tedious. Again, it's a game for certain people. It's not for everyone. You don't get to say it's a bad game because it's not for everyone. But this gameplay is bad. Basically, you just jumping back and forth between buildings and you get thrown weapons from within the tar, which is kind of a mechanic that you've bumped into before. It's not weird, but it's not weird and thrown on you then anyway. But you get thrown weapons and you have to pick them up and shoot this whale out of the sky. It just flies around. It's not a threat at all. It flies around and you just kind of like jump back and forth between buildings. The buildings will eventually that you're standing on will eventually like sink into the ground. And so you just jump on a different building. Do your best to get out of the tar as quick as possible. Do your best to dodge the attacks. It's not particularly threatening at all. And then you kind of walk into the end and then you have 2 hours, depending on how you describe it, 3 hours of cutscenes. 3 hours of cutscenes. I'm not kidding you. If you include the segments where you run around on the beach doing nothing for 20 minutes and you get maybe 3 or 4 minutes of dialogue as like your maybe 5. Let's say 5. Let's be generous and say 8 minutes of dialogue in like a 20-minute segment where the credits are rolling and then you get some dialogue and then more credits roll and then you get some dialogue and there's nothing to do except run around in an empty area. If you include segments like that or like segments where it's like, oh, yeah, nah, cool. And then obviously they're like, there's a lot of cutscenes here. Let's get them to walk from here to here and then we'll put them in another cutscene. But at least they will have done something in between the 40-minute block of cutscenes and the 1 hour block of cutscenes. That shit doesn't count. It doesn't count if you take 10 minutes to walk up a hill and then you get put into another 40 minutes of cutscenes. That's 3 hours of cutscenes at the end of the game. And the payoff for the entire story is just... I didn't get it. Like, let's just say that I didn't get it because it's just trash. It's so bad. Like, again, it's so, like, there's so many metaphors in this game that are trying to, like, layer themselves on top of everything. And you end up at the end of the game, which I'm not going to spoil this, okay? if you've played through the game, you know what the end of the game is. You know that the bit with the red ball is bad. The choice that you have to make at that point is not a choice. It's bad. The fight with Higgs is kind of cool in some ways, but really it's that kind of like phoned in, needs to be easy enough for the player that rushed through the entire game to beat boss at the end of the game. Like, that's not great. Just. And so the thing, because the thing with it all then ends up being like all of the stuff that you did throughout the entire story, which luckily wasn't particularly tied to the gameplay. Luckily, the gameplay was very independent of the story for this reason, because I can still love the game and the gameplay and just hate the story part of it. It means that none of it meant anything, because it's all like, oh, halfway through, we're going to do this knee-jerk reaction. We're going to talk about, now everything is about extinction entities that have not been brought up until just now. And then the entire rest of the story is about extinction entities and not about connecting people and not about saving Amelie, because it turns out Amelie was never captured in the fucking first place. It turns out Amelie was doing not doing dumb stuff, but like, Amelie was like this extinction entity, and so, the entire first part of the game is like, we gotta save Amelie, bear. She's bloody captured and there's terrorists and stuff. And then you get to the 2/3 of the way through the game and they're like, actually, she wasn't captured. And there are terrorists, but not in the way that we set up at the start of the game. And Amelie is actually a completely different component of the story, because she's not your sister and she's actually the harbinger of all doom in the planet and the world and everything. And just oh my god. And like I said, there's some okay parts. I think if you really just like took it at like face value and just didn't really like think about it too much and didn't dig into it too much and just took it as like a Kojima crazy like anime story, you'd be fine. It'd be fine. But I can't do that. As you can tell, I've already, analyzed a ton of it. And it's, I don't even know. I need a minute. Okay, let's just stop talking about the story. So, the gameplay is really good. The systems that you engage with the gameplay, excellent. The constant loops that you have to engage with that make the short to medium to long-term gameplay segments great and engaging, and you have to constantly think about this stuff, that's all awesome. That's all really good stuff, and I really like it. The story is not good. We just spent 20 minutes talking about it not being good. Enough said. It basically is just, it sets a whole bunch of stuff up, takes a U-turn or a left turn or a right, takes a U-turn, pretty much a U-turn, and then just decides to end up in a completely different spot. It's not a U-turn then, never mind. It takes a right turn, decides to end up in a completely different spot to where it was originally set out to be. The entire time it tries to make about 19 million metaphors, because your cufflinks are your phone, but your phone is handcuffing to you, and it's tying you down because thanks Kojima, thanks man. The level design is excellent. Some of the performances are really good. Like Margaret Qualley's performance is actually really good. Some of the concepts are really interesting. Like some of the way that the world is explored, some of the world building, like the world's interesting enough in its own right, like with the Death Stranding happened and came along, and then it kind of, there's all this Timefall stuff, and there's these BTs, and the BTs are connected to the things called beaches. Everybody has a beach. All that's pretty interesting. Like if it just had been delivered on a little bit better, it would have been good. Fragile is an interesting enough character, despite her amazing line of fragile, but I'm not that fragile. I'm sure you've heard. If you haven't, that's her catchphrase. Like legitimately, I'm not even kidding. Like I'm fragile, but I'm not that fragile. And she says it like probably like 6 times. Yeah, the social multiplayer part is really, really good too. That whole element of like having to connect to the network, and then once you're connected to the network, you get access to all this stuff that other people have done, and you can kind of think about it in this sort of like generous giving way, or you can think about it in a completely selfish way, and it's going to help other people anyway. That's all awesome. The whole like building structures and building roads to help out other people and to help yourself out, that's all awesome. That's really cool. I hope people even Kojima does stuff with that in the future, because that's a really cool concept. It is a meditative experience. People say that it's a meditative experience. It really is. It's that level of just enough engagement, because you got to be like, okay, I just need to go across here, but I don't want to fall over, but I need to make sure that I'm balanced, but all my packages are swaying back and forth and I'm losing balance to my left, so I need to right trigger. That all works really, really well. It's this, if you're into that sort of stuff, if you find it tedious, then you're going to find it tedious and you're not going to like the game, because the entire game is that. It's set yourself up in the management, in the inventory section when you take on an order, and then traverse the terrain and hope that that setup that you did, that house of cards that you built, will get you to the end and not come crumbling down. That foundation that you build right at the start when you take on an order is what sets you up for gameplay fun or gameplay disaster. And to a degree, the entire game, like I said, if you build the roads, if you set a nice strong foundation for future deliveries, you're going to have a good time, because you can quick and easily get between different areas, and then maybe there's a difficult part that you have to get up to, but it's just a short piece because you could drive basically up to the foot of the mountain. If you don't put the time in to have a good time, if you don't put the time in to have a good time, if you don't put the time in to like build that kind of stuff, you're probably going to have a bad time, because every time you need to do a delivery, you're going to need to constantly bump back into the same problems that you're having with the terrain and that sort of stuff. Anyway, I think that's enough. Like, I really like Death Stranding. The story just really, really bummed me out. But the game is really, really good. The game is really good. And so we come to the end. There's going to be a few more of these on the channel if you wanted to listen to me talk about the other games that I played last year. But otherwise, Happy New Year. I hope you have a great 2020, and I will see you on the channel later this year.